Okay, so as children move from the sensory motor to this stage, which is the preoperational stage, according to Piaget, the preoperational stage can last from the 2-year range to around 7 years old. Okay, so just towards the end of early childhood. So the most obvious change is that there's a big increase in representational thought and symbolic activities. So for example, when we left off with the sensory motor stage, one of the last things that infants or toddlers start to begin to learn are mental representations, right? So being able to understand what the meaning of words are, or looking at a symbol and understanding that that may mean a word, right? When we look at a picture of an apple, we know the word that goes with it, A-P-P-L-E. So mental representations are very important, and it's very much a part of this stage. So these representations in the preoperational stage continue to get more refined, more specific, and in most cases more symbolic as well. So with that in mind, one of the major things that we know in the preoperational stage is more of the development of make-believe play. It's also called social dramatic play as well. So this is a good example of mental representations because through pretending, children can practice and they can strengthen whatever new material they have learned, and then any schemes they have learned, they can continue to adapt them or change them. So for example, you may see children using different objects for different things. So you may see, for example, a child have wooden blocks, and they're all different shapes. But let's say we have some that are very long and rectangular. Well, you may see a child start to put those together and making a road, right? Even though those necessarily are not used for that, right? It's not like they're actually a road, but typically we do stack up blocks like a tower. They're trying to use that in a different way. So they may use it as a road, or they may even symbolically think of it as, you know, a river of lava and you have to jump over it. So those are all symbolic representations of the world around them. So this is the second major stage of cognitive development, according to Piaget, the preoperational stage. So in the next age range that we'll be talking about will be middle childhood, and you'll start to see that the concrete operational stage will be discussed more oftenly. And then Piaget's last stage is the formal operational stage. But we'll talk about the pre-operational stage because it's very specific to early childhood. Okay. So there are some cognitive advances when it comes to early childhood. So this is kind of what Piaget was saying. So yes, the use of symbols become more advanced. Some other things that become more advanced are understanding of identities, understanding cause and effect, the ability to classify objects, understanding numbers, empathy as well, and then theory of mind. So we'll talk a little bit about some of these. So for example, use of symbols. I already talked about one of those, but let's say another example is that, let's say we have a little boy and he's playing with another, you know, child as well, and they pick up a banana, okay? And they start to use the banana as a walkie-talkie, and they're saying that they're going to go out into outer space, and they're trying to count down into their walkie-talkie. There's a banana saying in 3, 2, 1, we're going to blast off. And then the other child uses the button on the refrigerator as their blasting off button, right? So it's a good example of make-believe play and how you can imagine how objects or even people have other properties that we don't typically have, right? So obviously the refrigerator is not going to blast off into space, or the banana can't make communication with other people. It's just an inanimate object. But children start to use symbols more oftenly in this way, where they're thinking about objects not necessarily of how they are or how they look, but what other ways they can use them. So there's also understanding of identities. So this is where they start to understand that there's different ways of thinking about others, I guess you could say, or other individuals. So they're like have an awareness that their superficial alterations do not change the nature of things. So for example, with understanding of identities, you may start to see children engage in make-believe play a little bit more as far as taking on the identity of someone they know. Playing, role playing, so doing, mom and dad, scenarios where they make believe that there's a mom and a dad, or they make believe that they're a doctor and someone is the patient. So they're understanding that those different identities have different roles that they play and different behaviors and different responsibilities, right? We also see that they start to understand the cause of effect as well. So this is very superficial, but they start to understand that they do have a effect on the things around them, right? So you may start to see a little bit more understanding and awareness if, for example, a child accidentally spills milk, right? Let's say they're trying to make their own cereal and they drop it all, right? Well, they understand the cause and effect of that by dropping that, create the effect of that mess, and sometimes they may feel, guilty or shameful or bad about doing that. So they do see more cause and effect during this stage versus in infancy. You may see, an infant or a toddler drop something, but they really don't have a lot of understanding that they did that. It's kind of just something that happens. We also see the ability to classify. So this is where children start to gain more interest in organizing things. So this is where you start to see the beginnings of children being interested in collecting things. So I'm sure a lot of us had many things that we collected throughout our childhood. For myself, that was like a rock collection. I know some people love to collect like Pokemon cards or coins or things like that. Well, whenever you start to gain those interests, you're organizing those things. Like, for example, when I was collecting rocks, I would organize them by the shape, I would organize them by the color, I would organize them by where I found them, I would organize them on the type of rock that they were. So I'm putting those into meaningful categories. So I'm able to classify those things in a way where I'm able to understand it and keep track as well. Okay. And then next we have the understanding of numbers. So children start to have the ability to understand that there is more, how can I say this? There's more quantity, and they understand that if someone has more, then that's more in number. It is superficial, it's not very clear cut, the understanding of numbers, but they start to be able to understand that a little bit easier. So for example, you may have, let's say, 2 children and they're having lunch together, and one of their lunch has a snack, and that snack's a raisin box, right? So each kid has their own raisin box for a snack, right? And you see the raisin box, it's small, and everybody's, enjoying their lunch, having a snack. And let's say little girl just pours out all of the raisins on her plate. A little boy or a little girl may say, oh, man, she has more raisins than I do. So there's awareness that there is more quantity, right? But it's superficial in a way where they don't necessarily understand that really it's the same amount, but they just look and see it as a bigger amount because it's bigger than the box itself once you pour it out, right? So they have the ability to start to count things very small, so they can count up to, about 20 typically. In the early childhood stage. But when you see things like that, it's very superficial, and sometimes they lack that awareness and understanding of the logic that just because it looks bigger doesn't necessarily mean it has more quantity. Okay. Another advance in the preoperational stage is also empathy. So what is the difference between empathy and sympathy? Okay. So with empathy, there's differences between what is empathy, what is sympathy, as I was saying before. So with empathy is kind of just putting yourself in that other person's shoes, so kind of understanding what they are feeling, understanding, how that emotion is experienced. That's empathy. On the other hand, sympathy is great as well, but it's less, it's more basic and of understanding. So when you're sympathetic, you acknowledge another person's, feeling very upset. You acknowledge that they have a lot of hardships, and you provide comforts and assurance. But just because you have sympathy doesn't necessarily you have empathy as well. So sympathy is just, providing the care and understanding. And empathy is kind of that next level where you actually understand the experience of that emotion that that person's feeling. So we do start to see empathy for children in this preoperational stage. So, compare it with toddlers. So toddlers who are 2 or 3, preschoolers kind of rely more on words to communicate their empathetic feelings, and they are more reflective in their level of empathy. So, for example, let's say you have like a 4-year-old, and let's say she got an extra gift for Christmas, okay? And let's say that extra gift wasn't on her list for Christmas. This 4-year-old could have a little bit of empathy and be very upset and say, oh no, we got to give back this present. I didn't ask for this present. Santa made a big mistake, and I think it was meant for another girl, and I'm sure that other little girl is crying. So that's empathy. So putting herself in someone else's shoe, like if she didn't get the present she wanted, she would be upset and very hurt, right? So that's kind of just an example. Not that every child can experience this exact situation, but it's just an example of how empathy kind of looks like. Okay. Let's see what else. We have theory of mind. So that's a good one. I really like theory of mind myself. So this is it's actually a theory, obviously, but it's actually based on understanding social perceptions and perspective taking. And this theory has been used a lot to explain autism spectrum disorder. So there's actually some psychological tests and intelligence quotients or IQ tests that actually use this theory and the type of testing that they do. So for example, if you wanted to kind of gain a little bit more information as far as if your child had autism, that would be a good test to give. So a theory of mind test or a psychological test that has a focus in that could provide more information as to if this child has autism-related symptoms. Okay, so theory of mind goes very much in hand with empathy. So theory of mind basically means that a child is able to understand their own mental activity and understand how their mind kind of functions. And when you have a theory of mind, it's also understanding that when a child understands their own mental activity, they're able to cope in certain ways because they understand their mental activity. They're also able to understand different perspectives. So holding 2 perspectives in your mind is actually a higher level process. And being able to understand your mental activity makes it a lot easier for that to be achieved. So, for example, one of the tests that I have used, because I've tested children with autism before, is you don't have to know the name for it, but it's the NEPC, and there's actually a specific theory of mind test, and it's a neuropsychological test. But the subtest of theory of mind within it is actually you have a box, and within that box you have pencils or pens, whatever it may be. So you show this person or the student that you're giving a test to, so you show them the box and then you show them what's inside, right? So you open the box, you see a bunch of pencils or a bunch of pens in there, and then you also have a very similar box as well. Exactly the same thing, except there's no pencils, there's no pens in it. So you basically give them a scenario. So let's say you tell them, okay, well, I have these pens and pencils here, okay? And I'm going to lay them out on the desk, okay? And then George comes in and he sees that there's pens inside of this box, and then he leaves the room, okay? And then I switch the boxes, so then now I take away the box with the pens and leave the other box that looks just like it without the pens in there, and now Maria comes in. And then you ask the question to the child, like, do you think Maria knows if there's pens or pencils in there? Usually when a child lacks theory of mind, they don't understand that the second child doesn't have that information to make that decision. So because they have seen it all, the child has been being told the scenario, they believe that the second child should have that information too. So that's kind of showing the lack of understanding of perspective taking. So not being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, and like, if I was truly Maria, how would I really know the differences between these two boxes if I wasn't provided the information earlier? But because the child themselves saw it, these two different scenarios, they think that both people have the same information. So that's a lack of awareness and lack of theory of mind. And typically children who have autism will score very low on that. They have the challenges with perspective taking. Okay, so we'll go on to the next slide. So these are some other things that we should talk about. So the last slide was the advances of cognitive development in early childhood, and there's also still some limitations or immature aspects of the early child. So there's still a lack of these things here, so centration, irreversibility, etc., etc. So for example, although we're having these gains in mental representations, having these gains in empathy and theory of mind, children are still not fully fledged adults, and they're not able to have complex reasoning, abstract thought, or very logical thinking. Then they're still developing that. So there are some limitations on their logic and their thinking. So they do have limitation of centration. So this is where they're still focusing on one aspect of the situation and neglecting others. So this kind of goes back to an example that I provided earlier with understanding numbers. So they're able to understand numbers superficially, very small amounts of numbers. But when the larges get very large, or when things get bigger, they tend to use centration. So because it's just easier to understand things in that way. So a lot of children will focus on one aspect of something and not really look at all the other factors in relation to that event or problem, whatever it may be. So like I said, a good example of that is children tend to focus on the physical representations of what they're looking at. So for example, going back to the raisin and the lunchtime, they're looking at the physical aspect of that. So you see a small box of raisins, and then another girl has the same box of raisins, but pours them out all over her plate. When you compare how many she has on her plate and how many you can see, it looks like she has more. So that's centration. So they're focusing on one aspect, so the physical representation of how big something is. So a lot of times they will do that. Another example as well is when you're doing a conservation task with a child. The conservation task was developed by Piaget, but what the conservation task is basically you have a short glass of water, and then you also have a tall, skinny glass. So these two glasses, they look different, but actually they hold the same amount of water. So when you do this test with a child in early childhood, they tend to centralize their thinking. So they're focusing on one aspect of that problem or event. So what typically early children do is when you're asking them, okay, when I pour one glass of water to the other, which one holds more water? Or let's say you pour the short glass into the tall glass and you refill the short glass again, and you'd ask them, okay, now they're both filled with water, which one has more water, right? So typically in early childhood, they're going to make a mistake and they're going to say, oh, well, the tall skinny glass is because it's taller or it's bigger. And that's centration because they're focusing on the physical representation of what they're seeing, but not necessarily into the logic behind it. We also see that they still fail to understand irreversibility. Okay, so basically when something is changed, a lot of children will make the mistake that something can't be restored to its original form. Okay, so usually towards the end of the early childhood, they understand a little bit more of reversibility. But an example of irreversibility is, let's say you have a 3 or a 4-year-old. So irreversibility, as I said, for a 3 or 4-year-old could be that raisin example that I also said before. So they can't go through the necessary steps to kind of solve the problem. So if a child was able to, put all the raisins back and go, oh, well, it's the exact same amount because it fills the box up, well, that would be reversibility. So they understand that just because something changes, it can be reversed or it can be restored to its original function. So a child who is able to see it that way, where, oh, well, if I put all the raisins back, then we have the same amount, that would be reversibility, not irreversibility. So irreversibility is the lack of not being able to go through the necessary series of steps to kind of solve that problem, or even reverse the direction and returning to the starting point. So it's actually a very high complex way of doing things. We don't really think about it, but as adults, we do these things all the time. We go through reversibility, we go back and forth, through the beginning, through the end of something, and we trace back our steps and try to figure out what happened. It's actually very hard to do that cognitively, so a lot of children lack that irreversibility. Okay, let's see what else we got. So focus on states rather than on transformations. So this goes back into centration, but basically they're focusing rather on what is there in front of them physically rather than the logic behind it. Okay. We also have, let's see, I'm trying to think of another example before we move on. I don't know, we'll come back to it, I guess. So we also have transductive reasoning. So with this type of reasoning, basically they jump to conclusions without really going into the logic behind it. So, I mean, a very easy one, you could say that maybe a child hears a thunderstorm outside. They may say, oh no, so-and-so forgot to do the dishes, so it's raining outside, or whatever it may be. So obviously there's really no connection between those two things. But they're seeing a connection there. So they're not really able to kind of make a logical jump from one conclusion to another. So Piaget did a lot of, different tasks with children to kind of figure out their cognitive abilities. So he did also create a transductive task or transductive reasoning task. So basically, if you can kind of think about it, is that he'll show children just a bunch of sticks of different colors. And then from observing the stick A is longer than stick B, and stick B is longer than stick C, children should infer that A is longer than C. So with this is very kind of difficult cognitive reasoning. So a lot of children in the pre-operational stage have issues with that. So you may have even heard of examples as adults, like if A is greater than B and B is greater than duh, then C should be greater than blank, right? So this is transductive reasoning. So going from one part of the equation to another part to make logical sense. So this is very difficult for children, so they're really not able to do that according to Piaget. Another great task that Piaget created was also the three mountain problem as well. So with the three mountain problem, he was trying to figure out as far as what is the egocentricity, or how much egocentrism does a child have at this stage. And he did this three mountain problem with different ages to kind of see the differences between the two. But in toddlerhood and early childhood, we do see that there is more egocentrism. And basically how that task looks like is that there is a table, and then there's the child on one side of the table, and then a researcher at the other side of the table. And then on this table, there's a mountain, okay? And then on this mountain, they purposely put things on the mountain. So on one side of the mountain, there is, a cat, a dog, a flag, a house. On the other side, there's a car, there's chickens, there's cows, there's a blue flag instead of a red flag. So there's things purposely placed all around that mountain. So basically what the question that Piaget wanted to ask to kind of get into that egocentrism is to see how they perspective take in this situation. So how another person thinks, how another person feels, So what we do see with this problem is that when you have someone in early childhood, you ask them, okay, so what do you see from your side of the mountain? So the researcher would be asking the child, okay, tell me what you see. So if the child, is in front of the mountain, they see what they see, right? So let's say on the child's side of the mountain, they have the dog, they have the cat, and they have a blue flag and the house, right? And then the other side of the mountain, let's say they have a red flag, a cow, chicken, and a car, right? So now the researcher asked them what they saw, and they got it right. But now the researcher asked the second question and says, okay, so what do you see from my side of the mountain? And even sometimes this problem is changed or modified a little bit where the researcher's not really in that problem. It's more a doll is sitting at the other side. So they may ask, what do you think the doll sees from her side of the mountain? So what a preoperational child will say, according to Piaget, is, oh, well, I see a cat, a dog, a house, and a blue flag. And that's what they see on their side, the child's side. So they're not able to kind of look on the other side and say, oh, well, the dog really can't see what I am seeing. So they're not able to understand that, oh, maybe I should go over and look to see what the doll sees. Oh, well, the doll sees a car, chicken, a cow, and a red flag. So this is egocentrism, according to Piaget, where it's not necessarily that they're selfish or it's all about themselves or they're narcissistic. It just means that children only look at things from their own perspective. So everybody probably thinks like I do, or everybody should see things the way I do. And that's typically how the preoperational functions according to Piaget. Let's see, animism. That's also another limitation according to Piaget, but I also think it's a strength because it really strengthens make-believe play. So animism is basically giving life to inanimate objects. So for example, they may say, oh, well, why is it raining? And then the child may say, well, it's because a woman is crying, right? Well, the rain doesn't necessarily mean that a woman is crying. Or they may say, for example, a statue, they may talk to it and give it lifelike qualities. So this has a lot to do with make-believe play. Anytime we have anything that doesn't have any lifelike qualities, and we give it that lifelike quality, that's animism, and that's what a lot of preoperational children do. And then lastly, inability to distinguish appearance from reality. So sometimes they confuse what is real with outward appearance. So that kind of has to go back into what we talked about with their inability to properly use centration, irreversibility. So all of those limitations kind of feed into that overall. Well, sometimes they're distinguishing from appearance from reality. Sometimes it's not accurate. And if you want just some more examples, this is more going back to numerical understanding. So that was a gain like we talked about, but there is limitations to it. But these are just some very common patterns of what numerical ability children have in the early childhood range, so from 2 to 6. So counting they have, so 1-to-1 correspondence, counting in sequence like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Number knowledge, so discriminating and coordinating quantities, making numerical magnitude comparisons. These are all different areas where they start to gain numerical ability. But obviously it's not to where an adult is at, but it's just the very beginnings of that. Okay, so you can take a look at that on your own. Okay, so these are just some more examples of limitations in early childhood when it comes to what we've talked about over here. So let me go back really quick. So centration, irreversibility, ability to understand, classification and identities. So all these things have a role to play in conservation, which we'll talk more about in middle childhood as well. But overall in early childhood, they have some limitations when it comes to understanding logical thought. So these are just some conservation tasks that Piaget would do. So here's that liquid one that I talked about. So if you have 2 of the same glasses, and then you have a tall skinny glass and a short round glass, well, although they look different, right, they still have the same volume. So that's where children kind of have that inability to understand irreversibility, centration, and conservation. And they get this problem wrong, so they typically say, oh, well, this one right here, the tall, skinny one, is bigger because it's taller. And these are just some other ones right here. So this one has to do with length. So here we have these two same sticks. And when we move them farther apart like this, now you ask the child, okay, so which one do you think is longer? A preoperational child doesn't understand logic to the extent that older children do. So they typically say, oh, this one's longer because it's out farther, even though they were shown here that they're the same size. Where's the other one? And then this is also very similar too with length and also number. So you guys can see here we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. We have 12 coins here. And then over here, when we transform it into something else, we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. So we also have 12 coins here. So what's the difference between here is that we just move the spacing in between them, right? So these are a lot closer together, these 6 coins, and these are a little bit farther apart. So when you ask a preoperational child, okay, so which one has more coins in them, right? So which one has more? So typically a preoperational child is going to say this one because of centration. Like they're looking at the physical properties, like, well, oh, well, this one's farther out and looks longer than that one, so this one should have more coins. So they're just some examples. Take a moment to look at these. These are very interesting. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I'll see you in the classroom.